let's talk about some of the details having to do with the transpiration process. One of the things is that if you look at the root, so this is a diagram of the root, and it's talking about the different ways that materials can move into a root. There's basically three ways. There's apoplastic, symplastic, and transcellular. Apoplastic is in the cell wall continuum. So this is basically between the cells in the plasmodesmata. Now this diagram is somewhat incorrect in that once it reaches the endoderm, it can no longer go via the apoplastic route. So this line should not be going through the endoderm. The symplastic is going through the plasmodesmata. So once it enters through the root hair into a cell, it's going to go from cell to cell via the plasmodesmata. Now that's fairly fast, and that can occur. So once it gets up to the endoderm, it can go through the plasmodesmata of the endoderm and into the cell. Transcellular means across the cell membrane. So this would be across the membrane from one cell to both in one side and out the other side. And again, that can happen once we get to the endoderm. Now, ions are going to enter with the water, generally speaking. And it's going to enter by all of those situations. In other words, it's going to come in from the outside by any of the three ways. And once it gets to the endoderm, though, if it's an ion, it's going to be regulated across the membrane. In other words, ions will have to go via a membrane. It's either going to go by facilitated diffusion because there's a concentration gradient, and that's largely the way. Or if it's a very big ion, it would have to be transported across via an active transport kind of situation, which takes energy and such. Once it's inside, though, this is a better view than the last one. Once it's inside the endoderm, it's going to go into the xylem and then be transported around the plant. Now the xylem, remember, this is a picture of the leaf and the cohesion. So we had evaporation, diffusion, evaporation from the leaf. We had cohesion that's bringing it up the vessels, and then we have basically osmosis that's bringing it into the root. So this is just a kind of a recap. One thing, though, I want to talk about is in the xylem vessels. So in the xylem vessels, as it's getting pulled up, oftentimes what will happen is that something will block that xylem vessel. So it could be an air pocket. It could be material, like if a insect or something got in and left some debris there. Various things. It could be resin. But anyway, if that were to happen, so in this case there's an embolism there, meaning making a cavity that is present in one of the xylem vessels. The pits are going to act as a sideways movement. And I think I mentioned this before when we were talking about the xylem and the structure and such. But this is, now you maybe can see why that would happen. So as the water is being sucked up, this embolism is not a problem. Now it could be a problem if, for example, there was a heavy drought and there were so many embolisms that it was hard for the tree to suck up enough water to actually keep its stomata open. All right. Okay. So let's just talk about that a little bit. So stomata are open when the water is high enough. And the reason for that is this is representing a guard cell. And if a guard cell is full of water, it pulls it or it expands it. Normally it expands it evenly. That is, turgor pressure will push evenly on the cell wall and expand that cell evenly. And of course it doesn't expand that much. But in this case, because the guard cell has a thicker cell wall in the middle, what happens is the outer cell wall expands a little bit more than the internal one because it's pretty rigid, and that will pull the stoma open. That creates the stomata is, of course, the guard cell and the stoma that is in the epidermal cells, but the stoma is the actual hole. So if it has a lot of water or it has enough water, then the stomata can be open. And if it does not, then they close. So if this like shrinks down, then that is going to close those stomata. Generally speaking, the stomata are open during the day and closed at night. That is the factor of light being up, they open, light being down, they close. Other factors that affect are carbon dioxide. So if carbon dioxide was high, it would cause closure of the stomata. A natural situation that might cause that is fire. But we can use that in, let's say, refrigerator trucks that are cold, dark, and have a lot of CO2 being pumped in to keep our vegetables crisp and basically not doing anything, no photosynthesis or rotting of any type until they get to market. Here, temperature being high will cause the closure also, but temperature being real low will just cause low activity. Another thing is circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms, I give you a handout on that. Circadian rhythms are just cycles that occur that are not associated directly with the environment. So basically it'd be something like opening of the stomata in the day and closing at night that would even happen in space, even when there is no light or any other environmental clues. Okay. Now the rate of transpiration is affected. So once the stomata are open, then the transpiration rate can be affected by temperature, humidity, or wind. So if the temperature is very high, of course the evaporation is higher. Humidity high, the evaporation would be lower. So if it's like raining outside, it's going to be lower. Or if the wind is high, the evaporation is higher. So the worst time would be high temperatures and windy and dry conditions. That would be the hardest on a plant, or the most transpiration process. And of course the opposite is true. Some other things to know are something called root pressure, which creates guttation in some plants. What root pressure is that if there's, after the ions get into the xylem from one of the processes that we talked about, so once it gets transported into the xylem, then at nighttime, remember that the xylem is not pulling up the water anymore, because there's capillary action holding it in the water column, but the stomata are not open, so there's no longer a pull. So what happens is, because there's ions into the root, inside the root, then osmosis will still occur. So water will move from the soil into the xylem, even though it's not being pulled in. But in this case, it makes a pressure. That is, it'll push the water up the plant. And that can cause it to guttate, which means to come out of the leaf. In other words, it can push out of the stomata at night. In fact, a lot of plants in the morning, you might see a big droplet of water, and part of that might be from guttation. Some plants even have a specific little, it's called a hyode, I think, that is, it's a structure that actually allows this guttation to occur because it occurs so frequently with them. Another thing is hydraulic lift. So really deep roots that are in moister soil at nighttime, when there isn't a pull on the roots, and remember that most of the roots that are taking up water are in the surface of the soil. If a deep root is in a lot of water, it's going to then be pulling water into the deep root, and it will move from that high concentration to a lower concentration of the shallower roots, and this is called hydraulic lift.